Joining us right now is that committee's chairman, Patrick McHenry. Chair McHenry, what do you plan to ask today?
I think the basics, they didn't really cover this yesterday, but the basic decision-making of that week. What do they know on Monday, Tuesday, going into Wednesday, where the bank run began, Thursday, where it got heightened, and then obviously all their decision-making on Friday. And so the Fed has some questions to answer about that week, especially the vice chair for supervision, who has all the regulatory powers of the Fed reporting to him, and the chair of the FDIC from that moment on Friday, where they took the institution going into Sunday. On Friday, they said it was an idiosyncratic institution, and by Sunday, they had a systemic risk designation that said they're going to backstop all the deposits. I want to understand the decision-making of those key hours, those key moments. I think the American people deserve that transparency.
I mean, it was a little shocking to hear some of those details yesterday. The idea that there were $100 billion in one day that was scheduled to go out after losing $42 billion the next day. I mean, that's, I don't think we've ever seen
it's a jaw-dropping
withdrawals
number
like that.
No, and frankly, this is what I'll say at the hearing. Frankly, we have a massive amount of regulation looking very specifically at the details of banks. But the hole in the balance sheet was obvious in a Wall Street Journal report as of November. The Fed had detailed this at the board level in February. They were aware of the hole in the balance sheet because of the inflationary environment. The second piece was the magnitude.
That was shocking.
Well,
I think February, the month before, was too late, but the Fed did have some people out at the San Francisco Regional Fed Bank, at least, that was looking at things as early as a year earlier. Why didn't that get kind of called up the flagpole sooner?
Right. So they had the right documentation to say that they'd ping the institution, and the institution was attempting to comply. But did the vice chair for supervision make provision for the institution in a moment of crisis? But in the key hours of Thursday, when the bank run began at Silicon Valley Bank, what was the decision making at the Fed? And so we want to understand that. We obviously, the magnitude of the withdrawals was something that we've not seen the likes of in any bank run in human history. It was faster and of a larger magnitude than anything else. So very hard to say that it's a regulatory change or a law that would anticipate something that bank supervisors had assumed would not be the case in a moment of stress.
I guess my question to this is, what do you think? Obviously, you said we don't know everything yet, but heading into this, is it your suspicion that this was a one-off or a two-off if you look at Signature Bank? Or do you think that there are a lot of other institutions, other banks out there that could be at risk in similar manners?
Well, that's a very good question that we need the panel to answer. It's also important that we actually lay down the facts of the matter of that week. There's much that we don't know. We read press reports and glowing reports of how valiantly they fought the fight. What we don't know is the data they were using and the methodology that they undertook these extraordinary measures.
I know you've raised some questions about whether there was a viable private sector option for SVB and for Signature Bank. What have you heard that have brought you to those questions?
Well, you heard testimony from Chairman Grunberg that the FDIC had two bank bids, two bids from banks. Was there a lens at the FDIC that they wouldn't take a willing and able offer on the table that weekend? Why did they decide to not do that? We've obviously seen the larger ramifications in the last 2 weeks across the banking sector and across the economy. So in that weekend, it seems to me that they failed to do their duty at the FDIC and hitch a failed bank up with a going concern to make the depositors whole and calm the markets.
Chairman McHenry, when it comes to just the Fed's oversight, I mean, there have been so many questions that have been raised. First of all, the idea that SVB didn't need to meet some of the bank's stress tests, but then even if they were kind of forced into the stress test and run through those same tests, they were looking at a scenario where interest rates were dropping, not rising rapidly like was happening at that moment.
Right, and you're only as good as the math, right, in the assumptions of those stress tests. I think the larger point here is the resiliency of institutions in their capital structure to meet moments of stress. The vice chair for supervision said he's going to have this undertaking on a holistic review on capital. He didn't talk about liquidity. And in this moment, liquidity was the issue for their performance on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of that week they failed. You also have the institution of Signature Bank and First Republic were regulated by the FDIC. So the FDIC has supervisory powers that they have to answer for as well, not just the decisions of that weekend.
You know, we're looking to try and figure out what happened when we're not even sure if the stresses in the system have kind of worked their way through at this point. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it hasn't. If you're waiting to see what happens with mortgage-backed securities, if you're waiting to see what happens with commercial real estate, so far, there have been more than 40 Republicans who have said that they're not interested in any sort of moral hazard being extended. They don't want to insure deposits. I'm sure there are some Democrats who feel the same way. Is there anything that you might hear this week that would change your mind on a subject like that, just based on how quickly these things were moving and what the potential contagion for risk was?
Well, look, I've kept an open mind about this. I was a member of Congress during the financial crisis, so I want to make sure that we have a resilient and safe financial system in America today. We simply can't rely on the regulators to get it right. We need to have public data and real transparency so the market can get it right. I think that's the key takeaway here is a lack of transparency in the decision making, and the data they used has made things less certain rather than more certain, and our system less stable rather than more stable.
Patrick, as an aside, yesterday we had one of your colleagues, the Speaker of the House, was on talking. I know you saw the letter he sent to President Biden. They got a lot of attention. I'm not sure whether the president responded directly to what's happening, but it is a concern for the markets, given, I mean, if, you know, you can imagine if Silicon Valley Bank, if something like that can put tremors into the financial markets, you can imagine as we get closer to the debt ceiling. There were some people that said that Speaker McCarthy has got his own problems in his own caucus, and maybe that was an attempt to maybe push it off on the Biden administration and Democrats. Is there a consensus on what to do in the House right now about the debt ceiling and how to arrive at some type of negotiation with the Biden administration or Democrats?
Well, look, the Speaker made it clear his approach on raising the debt ceiling is different than previous speakers. He'd prefer to sit down with the president and negotiate this out. No brinksmanship, do it ahead of time, have an active set of conversations like they did in 2011 that then Vice President Biden led on behalf of the Obama administration. That's the Speaker's preference. And that is different than what people assumed. Everybody assumed he would want to be a hellraiser and be a flamethrower because of how the tight margins are in the House. He wanted to take this thing in a different direction. I welcome that. Look, I don't want any brinksmanship here on the debt ceiling. I've made that very clear internally to my colleagues, very clear publicly. I don't think America needs that sort of trepidation around the Treasuries market in a time of rising rates. Now, having said that, the Speaker had an active outreach to the President. The President did not respond. There are no conversations happening between staffers for the Speaker, those of us that work on behalf of the Speaker, or the leadership team here in the House of Representatives. There's no conversations with the White House. And look, I have been an optimist that we can get this thing done, that reasonable minds can work something out without a lot of drama. I don't see how we get there at this point.
The Speaker also threw out yesterday, though, the idea that, look, you would have energy independence discussed during this. There would seem to be some forced limitations as to how much you can put into this. If you're looking at ways to cut the budget, okay, fine, let's talk about that. Let's have a budget from both sides. But the idea that you're going to throw in a wish list of everything you want to negotiate may not be the best starting point for a negotiation.
Well, and that's actually what the president did with his budget. And a budget has not a damn bit to do with the debt ceiling increase. Everyone knows that here in Washington. So what I'm saying here is The Speaker had a sincere outreach to the President. The President's rebuked that. We can send a bill over to the Senate, like what happened in 2011 and 2013, which ended up in severe brinksmanship and bad outcomes. We're trying to avoid that. And I think what the Speaker said publicly was his private frustration that he shared with us for weeks, a number of us personally for the last couple of weeks. This is not my preference. I don't want drama. Let's work it out.